comes a moment in life when a human being can keep walking, working, conquering, and even believing they are moving forward, while silently they have already lost their way. They are still standing, still breathing, still carrying their plans, but something essential has vanished. It was not necessarily strength. It was not necessarily intelligence. It was the memory of why they began walking in the first place. It is precisely at this point that the ancient story of the Lotus-Eaters becomes far deeper than a simple adventure of Odysseus. In the Odyssey, after the fall of Troy, Odysseus begins his long journey back to Ithaca. But this voyage can be read symbolically as something greater, the journey of the human being toward that which they recognize as their true home. In this reading, Ithaca ceases to be merely a geographical location. It can represent the center to which the individual must return after traversing the experiences that transform them. Odysseus, therefore, can be understood as an image of the common human being, not a perfect, enlightened, or fully conscious man, but someone who begins his walk carrying desires, flaws, impulses, fears, pride, and contradictions. He must cross through experiences that reveal who he is, and his companions can be seen within this symbolic interpretation mixed as different aspects of the human condition itself, parts of ourselves that have not yet been mastered, educated, or integrated. Thus, the voyage is not merely a sequence of adventures. Every obstacle can represent a possibility for transformation. The human being encounters forces they must face, temptations they must recognize, illusions they must abandon, and situations that reveal what still resides within them. The outer journey transforms, in this way, into the possibility of an inner journey. But there is a fundamental difference between simply living through experiences and acquiring consciousness through them. A person can suffer and remain exactly the same. They can travel without ever understanding the journey itself. They can acquire knowledge without transforming their way of existing. Therefore, the true journey does not consist merely of reaching the destination. It consists of becoming capable of recognizing the destination. And it is precisely here that the Lotus-Eaters appear. Because after facing dangers, crossing seas, and surviving the first stages of his long journey, Odysseus encounters something that seems far less threatening than everything he has faced so far. There is no monster waiting to attack him. There is no army prepared to destroy him. There is no battle. There is only a peaceful land, a people who offer a sweet food, and an experience that is seemingly pleasant. And perhaps that is precisely why this episode hides one of the deepest warnings in the entire Odyssey. Because there are dangers that seek to destroy the human being, and there are far more silent dangers, those that make the human being forget where they were going. Odysseus and the journey of consciousness. If Odysseus can represent the human being on their journey, then every stage of his voyage can be understood as an experience capable of revealing something about the one who walks. The question is not simply how many dangers he manages to overcome, but what each experience produces inside him. Because there is a vast difference between going through an experience and learning from it. The human being begins their journey believing they know themselves. They believe they know their desires, their limits, their certainties, and even the path they intend to follow. But life begins to strip away, bit by bit, that security. The individual encounters obstacles, losses, temptations, desires, and situations they cannot control. And it is precisely when who they imagine themselves to be begins to be put to the test that the possibility of consciousness emerges. In this sense, Odysseus's journey can be understood as a process of transformation. First, there is the man who sets out. Then, there is the man who faces that which he does not know. And finally, there is the possibility of a different man emerging, one different from the man who began the journey. But this transformation does not happen automatically. It is possible to cross the entire world and remain a prisoner of oneself. It is possible to meet people, lose things, conquer others, suffer, love, grow old, and still never ask what all these experiences are trying to reveal. Therefore, within this symbolic reading, consciousness is not born simply because we live. It is born when we begin to perceive the meaning of what we live. And perhaps that is why the Odyssey can be read as a grand image of the human condition. Odysseus does not merely need to reach Ithaca. He needs to become capable of returning, because returning physically is one thing. Returning to oneself is something completely different. Throughout this journey, there are forces that can divert him from his purpose. Some are violent and easy to recognize. Others are seductive. Some threaten his life. Others threaten something even deeper, his inner direction. And among these threats, there is one that is especially dangerous because it does not look like a threat. It offers pleasure. It offers rest. It offers forgetfulness. It offers the possibility of simply stopping. It is here that we must understand one of the central ideas of the Lotus-Eaters. The problem does not begin when man suffers. The problem begins when he finds a condition so comfortable that he no longer desires to continue his journey. In the land of the Lotus-Eaters, Odysseus's companions experience exactly this. They eat the lotus and cease to desire the return. They do not need to be chained. They do not need to be convinced by force. The very desire to return home disappears. And this image is extraordinarily powerful, because what binds a human being is not always a chain. Sometimes it is that which they can no longer abandon because it has become too comfortable. The Lotus-Eaters and forgetfulness. It is at this point that the land of the Lotus-Eaters reveals its true symbolic strength. The danger is not simply in the food. The danger lies in what the food produces inside the one who consumes it. The lotus causes the desire to return to vanish. And when the desire to return vanishes, something fundamental begins to disappear along with it. Man may continue to exist, but he is no longer oriented by that which once gave meaning to his path. In the narrative, Odysseus's companions eat the lotus and no longer want to return home. They want to remain in that place. What was once merely a stage of the journey becomes enough. The journey loses its meaning because the destination has ceased to matter. And here arises one of the most powerful images of the episode. They are not defeated by an external force. They are overcome by an internal transformation. No one needs to force them to stay. They simply no longer want to leave. Symbolically, this can represent the moment when the human being stops pursuing what they recognized as essential and begins begins to accept an existence reduced to immediate comfort. They keep living, but their life loses direction. They keep breathing, but no longer know exactly for what. They keep accumulating experiences, but stop walking towards something they consider truly theirs. It is dispersion, and dispersion can be far more dangerous than it seems. Because when we are facing an enemy, we know we need to fight. When there is a clear threat, our consciousness awakens. But when everything seems pleasant, when there is no immediate suffering, when we can simply stay where we are, the need for transformation can vanish. The lotus in this reading represents precisely this seduction. The seduction of stopping. The seduction of forgetting. The seduction of no longer needing to answer the difficult questions that the journey demands. And this can happen in countless ways in human life, not necessarily through a specific pleasure, but through any condition that allows us to permanently escape from ourselves. We can distract ourselves so as not to think. We can occupy ourselves so as not to feel. We can continuously seek stimuli so as not to confront the emptiness. We can build a comfortable routine and slowly abandon what we once considered essential. The problem is not resting. The problem is turning rest into a destination. The problem is not seeking pleasure. The problem is allowing pleasure to replace purpose. And the problem is not desiring a peaceful life. It is forgetting that there is a difference between peace and stagnation. The Lotus-Eaters can represent precisely this psychological territory, where the individual no longer suffers enough to want to change, but is also not conscious enough to perceive that they have stopped moving forward. That is why the image of forgetfulness is so profound. It is not merely about forgetting events. It is about forgetting who we are, what we seek, and why we began walking. And perhaps it is precisely there that we find the most disturbing meaning of the lotus. Because that which makes us forget our pain can also, under certain circumstances, make us forget our purpose. And when a human being forgets their purpose, they can continue living for many years without realizing that, inwardly, they have already abandoned their own journey. Part 4. When forgetfulness becomes a prison. But there is something even deeper in this story. If the Lotus-Eaters represent the forgetfulness of purpose, then an inevitable question arises. What happens when a human being realizes they are forgetting? This is where Odysseus becomes different from his companions. In the Odyssey, Odysseus does not eat the lotus. When he perceives the effect that food produces, he does not try to convince his men through long speeches. He acts. He removes them from that place and leads them back to the ships, because he understands something essential. As long as someone remains within the territory of forgetfulness, their very will may cease to desire that which needs to be recovered. This image is extraordinarily important, because there comes a moment when consciousness must intervene before unconsciousness transforms a fleeting choice into a permanent condition. Odysseus's companions do not seem to perceive immediately that they have lost something. On the contrary, they are satisfied. They feel no need to return. And perhaps that is precisely the most dangerous characteristic of certain forms of alienation. An individual can be detached from themselves without feeling that they are lost. It is possible to be lost and feel comfortable. It is possible to be distant from who we truly are and call it freedom, it is possible to abandon an old aspiration and say that we have simply matured. And sometimes we really do mature. Not every abandoned dream is a loss. Not every old goal continues to make sense. Consciousness also means knowing how to transform what we desire. But there is a difference between consciously abandoning a path and simply forgetting why we were walking. That difference is fundamental. Odysseus represents, in this sense, a consciousness that still preserves an inner reference point. He knows he needs to return. Ithaca continues to exist within his orientation, even when he is physically very far from it. And here, we can deepen the symbol even further. Ithaca does not need to represent a perfect destination. It can represent that which gives coherence to existence. It can be a vocation, a principle, an inner truth, an essential relationship, a life project, a spiritual pursuit, or simply the need to become what we feel. On some level, we are capable of being. Therefore, returning to Ithaca does not necessarily mean returning to the past. It means recovering direction. And this distinction completely changes the interpretation of the journey. The human being does not evolve simply by accumulating experiences. They evolve when they manage to integrate those experiences into their consciousness. First, they live. Then, they perceive. Then, they understand. Then, they transform. And finally, they return different from the one who set out. This is the profound movement we can see behind Odysseus's voyage. But there is an even greater revelation, because perhaps the Lotus-Eaters are not merely in some distant place in the world. Perhaps the true land of the Lotus-Eaters can appear within everyday life itself. It can emerge when a person trades purpose for distraction, when they trade presence for constant stimulation, when they begin to live, merely reacting to what happens, when they stop asking where they are going because they are too busy trying to get somewhere. And this is one of the most disturbing paradoxes of modern existence. The more possibilities we have to distract ourselves, the easier it can become not to perceive our own disorientation. The lotus can be understood then, not as a specific object, but as a metaphor for that which anesthetizes consciousness. And anesthesia does not necessarily mean suffering. Sometimes, that which anesthetizes is pleasant. That is precisely why it is so powerful. The problem is not feeling pleasure. The problem begins when we use pleasure so we no longer have to look within. The problem is not resting. It is when rest transforms into an escape. The problem is not abandoning a goal that no longer makes sense. It is when we abandon our direction without ever discovering what truly happened to us. And perhaps that is the reason why the episode of the Lotus-Eaters remains so relevant today. Odysseus faces monsters, storms, and external dangers. But before the Lotus-Eaters, he faces something different. He needs to preserve the capacity to want to return. Because a person can survive a battle and still lose their own inner life. They can defeat enemies and be vanquished by apathy. They can conquer the world and forget why they wanted to conquer it. And here we arrive at the central point. The true prison does not begin when someone prevents the body from leaving. It begins when the soul no longer desires to leave. The lotus is powerful because it eliminates the need for the chain. It does not need to say, "You cannot go back." It simply brings forth another phrase, "I no longer want to go back." And perhaps that is one of the greatest symbolic warnings of Odysseus's journey. It is not enough to have a destination. one must remember it. It is not enough to begin a transformation. One must remain conscious along the way. It is not enough to experience life. One must ask what life is doing to us. And perhaps, at some point, we will all find our own land of the Lotus-Eaters. A psychological place where everything seems comfortable enough for the fundamental question to cease being asked. Where am I going? Because as long as that question still exists, the journey continues. But when it vanishes completely, the human being can remain in motion on the outside and yet have stopped on the inside. That is why Odysseus must leave that land. Not because all pleasure is dangerous, not because all comfort is a trap, but because no place can replace that which still needs to be fulfilled. The journey requires continuity, and consciousness requires memory. Memory not merely of the past, but of that which, in the past, we recognized as essential. Perhaps that is precisely what the Lotus-Eaters are teaching us. There are moments when we need to forget, but there are also things we can never allow to be forgotten, because some memories do not serve to bind us to the past. They serve to prevent us from losing the future. And perhaps Ithaca is exactly that. Not merely the place Odysseus wishes to return to, but the reminder that there is still a place he needs to walk toward. And when we understand this, the episode of the Lotus-Eaters ceases to be just a small adventure within the Odyssey. It turns into a mirror in which we can recognize ourselves. Because perhaps the most important question is not, are you moving forward? But another, far more difficult one. Do you still know where you are going? And it is precisely after this question that Odysseus' journey becomes even deeper. Because remembering the destination is only the first step. The true challenge begins when a man must discover who he has become after everything he has lived.